Hey there, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second segment of our True Talk Thursday vodcast. Tonight, we're really focusing on trauma, resilience, and recovery. And we have the honor and privilege of continuing the conversation with Hector Montenegro. But this time around, we will be discussing the tools and strategies that adults should use to address trauma in students. So without further adu, Maria, take it away.
So Hector, we left off talking about the aspect of tools and being able to you mentioned restorative practice. That's a strategy or a tool that can be used. And we all have different experiences in working with school districts and taking a look at how to address trauma issues. What have you found are some more tools or strategies that as the adults are actually working through this for kids, they are actually benefiting from it too?
You're right. And, like I said, this is kind of an evolving science, and not only an evolving science, but it's an evolving skill set. And this is an area that we as educators have not been properly trained. It hasn't been on our radar. A lot of times we're reacting to zero tolerance mentality that we used to, we still have in many cases, and that anything that deviates from, quote, the norm is punished severely with more punitive strategies. But we're realizing that it really exacerbates the situation. And so there are things that we just really need to think about, because a lot of times what happens is that children could actually be punished for trauma-related behavior. And because we don't know and we haven't been properly trained and understand that, the children that have adverse childhood experiences, when they misbehave, when they act out, when they are aggressive, and when they are very defensive, when they begin to hoard things for survival purposes, then what happens is that they have these social deficits. And if it's not properly diagnosed, what happens is the system punishes them. And what they actually do is they re-traumatize through punishment for deficit behaviors and skills. So in a way, it's kind of like double jeopardy. They really have not been supported. They have not, their issues have not been properly addressed. And when they act out or when they deviate from the norm, then they're punished. And what happens, it traumatizes them again. And that in itself, it layers the level of ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences impacting on the child. And eventually it can result in some very severe behavior, whether it be antisocial behavior or perhaps even self-destructive behaviors. And so, we talk about children that get into substance abuse, they get into self-mutilation, and things like that. So it can have a severe impact. So there's some basic principles that we often talk about with a trauma-informed approach. We really need to make sure that the adults have a basic framework. No way does this make them experts, but certainly it gives them tools to respond. And first and foremost, it's just realizing, especially now, that trauma does exist. That children who are less resourced have had scarcity in their home environment. There may be multiple families, so they don't have that opportunity to social distance, as we were talking about. They don't have that opportunity to have their own privacy. A lot of times they don't have equipment. They don't have regular schedules. And what happens is that it creates a disequilibrium in their own way of thinking. They don't have access to other adults that are perhaps more informed as to how to deal with their emotions. And so you get a lot of issues that we overlook in education. And it's even more difficult trying to do this remotely. But, and I'll talk a little bit about ideas to do it remotely. But the first thing is just realizing, we as adults need to know what are some of the types of trauma that children experience, and what are some of the strategies available to us. And first thing is just that realization. The second thing is recognizing how trauma affects individuals, including ourselves. We can have secondary trauma. by dealing with children with primary trauma and children who come from situations and circumstances that have been really absolutely catastrophic. We heard about the fires in California. Families lost everything. There are thousands of homes in California and Colorado that have been destroyed, and they barely escaped with their lives, let alone their belongings. That can be very traumatic. And that means that they're not resourced. They don't have access to the technology because they've lost everything. They don't have perhaps even money. But those who are more resourced are able to have greater structure for the children. So recognizing how trauma affects all individuals. It's not about class, it's not about race or even socioeconomic or ethnic background, and how trauma affects us, whether we're traumatized by the lack of regularity in terms of practice. We hear people say, we need to get back to normal. Well, I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen anytime soon. So being able to adjust to involuntary transitions, involuntary changes in our way of being can be very traumatic. And we as adults oftentimes don't know how to identify it and acknowledge that. And finally, how to respond, putting the knowledge you have into practice. So we're talking about first being aware of it, realize that trauma does exist and how does it happen. Second of all, realizing and recognizing how it affects us and how it affects children. And third, responding are those tools. Sometimes they're very basic. We tend to see when a child misbehaves or when a child is struggling with a certain issue, or perhaps when a child acts out, our first instinctive response is to ask them, what's wrong with you? Yeah. Almost accusatory, demeaning, punitive. If you don't straighten up, we're going to straighten you out. And so a simple tool that an adult can use, which is restorative, is ask the child to be reflective. Tell me what's happening with you. How can I help you? Can you describe how you're feeling? And what actually is going on in your mind? What is happening with you? And then offer that sense of support, that sense of well-being, that sense of understanding that you have, as adults, ability to transform a child's life or even a colleague, another adult, simply by the way you respond. And again, children could shout out, they have to release all that energy. And also the fear, the fight factor, when they feel threatened, they'll turn and fight. And of course, we suspend for fights, but at the same time, there's a way to deal with that. And when adults have better tools and responding in a more compassionate, empathetic, and also with love and patience, eventually that's when we get on the track of resilience and that self-awareness, helping the child and helping the colleague come to terms with that emotional rush, that destabilization that occurs as a result of certain triggers. Those are tools that I would say that adults need to know about. There's a really great book by Sowers and Hall. It's called Fostering Resilient Learners: Strategies for Creating a Trauma-Sensitive Classroom. So you can look it up, Sowers and Hall. And they talk about the importance of creating a trauma-sensitive classroom. And that helps children to become resilient learners. So they come from an experience that they have or multiple experiences into a classroom that needs to be safe, a classroom where things are organized in a way that there's consistency. There's structure, there are routines, there are circumstances in which they can seek help. There are approaches that they know that even their peers can be sensitive to their particular needs and behaviors. So there are a lot of things that we can do in the classroom to help. And so I just want to list 4 things just to be aware of. So these trauma-informed practices are based on 4 basic principles. One is an authentic, caring community, whether it's remotely or face-to-face. even with social distancing, you can have an authentic and caring community rather than a regimented, strictly designed to keep kids, socially distanced. There has to be a caring, authentic sense of being so that children can feel that there is a refuge, there is a place where I can feel that I belong. Those caring relationships, we as adults need to practice that more because we're so programmed to believe that it's the bottom line, the accountability. We got to get these kids, to pass the statewide assessments and to standards, to teach the standards and cover the content. And we just can't do that remotely. That's just not happening. So the third is supportive structures and practice applications. Adults need to support each other in implementing these applications. And finally, adults, we need to do our own work. We need to manage our own emotions. We need to reflect on how we're coming across to the students, how we're showing stress. And sometimes it's okay to be transparent. Children need to know that we're also struggling, and that creates a more empathetic and compassionate learning environment.
That's excellent. We talk about tools because we don't lack any data or of taking a look at what the trends have been, because you mentioned certain disasters, that's trauma in and of itself for various communities. And so we've had these happen over time. I was chatting with a buddy of mine just the other day, and we were talking about it's 15 years since Katrina, and some data came out where the communities, the students that were impacted at that time, now 15 years later, that they followed these kids, and they are still in the recovery because they lost so much. And that if we have this already patterned out, that we need to be responsive in the recovery efforts all the more sooner than later, if there's anything that we learn. So let's talk a little bit about the recovery efforts piece. It's hard to even think or imagine about recovery when you're in the thick of the trauma. It's like you're trying to just get through what's going on. So, like you said, with all the disasters that have happened and the traumas that vary, what are some steps that we could take towards recovery efforts with what's going on right now?
Absolutely. And I have to say that we have just seen so many issues globally. We know at the border, the families were separated. That is going to have such a profound impact, especially on not the younger, the younger they are, the more resilient they tend to be. But as you see children age, there's an age in which the bonding has occurred with parents, and when you rip them apart, that can change their life for the rest of their life. And so when we look at remedies or strategies, in a way, it really does need to be taken into consideration the age, the magnitude of the situation, and also the relationship between adults. So one of the things that I am working with is with social and emotional learning, and that's not about fixing kids. It is about being proactive and developing skills in order to be able to recognize and identify emotions, part of your being self-aware. Also, your ability to manage and control your emotions, to regulate those emotions, to set and achieve goals. So if you have a certain trigger or a certain memory of an event, one of the goals that you set is to be able to not necessarily forget about it, but certainly be able to manage the way, to regulate the way that you respond to circumstances that may trigger a certain behavior. And so it allows you that time, in a sense, to recover and to be resilient, certainly not to forget. Another thing is that social awareness, that awareness that others around us are experiencing different levels of issues and degrees of traumatization. And we can't just say, well, I was able to overcome it. My parents were, farm workers, and we're able to be okay. Look at me. That's being very self-centered, but looking at circumstances and being that more compassionate and empathetic is that part of that social awareness. Establishing and maintaining positive relationships. We as adults need to help children establish and maintain. In fact, when I work with schools, this is pre-pandemic, especially with high school and middle school. When I directly work with adults, they say, well, we need to use SEL to fix the kids. Then I work with the kids and they say, the adults don't teach us how to regulate our emotions. They don't teach us even how to make friends. That's one of the most stressful experience for children is the fear of being rejected.
Traumatized in school.
Yes. So these are things that we just, as adults, we lose focus on, just those simple things and how to establish and maintain relationships and using those competencies to make responsible decisions. But I have to say this, that SEL, if it's not racially just, if it's not equitable, if it's not inclusive and culturally responsive, it's not a trauma-informed SEL practice. So we need to take into consideration the socioeconomic factors that we're dealing with and don't take things for granted. And we know we're dealing with children from all backgrounds, from all socioeconomic levels, but some are impacted more severely than others. So I would say that there are a lot of areas that I had mentioned about creating a more compassionate, accepting environment. So going from a reactive institutional environment to an inclusive environment. So there are a lot of circumstances where we don't indulge into problem-solving skills. That's an SEL capacity. It's that ability to regulate your emotions as an adult and as a leader in order to reflect on the circumstances and perhaps options to resolve and repair harm. So that is one area where help children not only to reassess their own self-esteem, but their own sense of worth and also their ability to recover. And so as adults guide children to help them reflect on their own emotions and to also practice skills such as restorative practices. Also, we as adults need to have a more growth mindset about the ability of children to overcome these rather than saying, they're permanently damaged. But we need to believe that children can overcome these issues and circumstances because the brain has a great deal of elasticity. I mean, the rest of our life, our brain still has some degree of elasticity. And also having that ability to help children linking cause to effect. So when the brain shuts down and you get into survival mode, the fight, flight, or freeze, then you can't go from short-term memory to long-term memory or to make connections between relationships, cause and effect. So if I blurt out in class, how can I understand better what that means in terms of impact on other people around? So as we help children reflect on cause and effect, they can recover. There's ability to recover depending on, again, the severity. And one of the things that we lose sight on, there's so many different strategies. And again, I recommend that you look into the research and also look at practices from another school districts that you need to practice for the adults to internalize the belief system and how to help children to recover, but also practice the skill set in how to respond to what you may identify as trauma-related behavior. And the children need to practice. Even the parents or guardians need to have that opportunity to help to nurture their own children. So verbalizing your strategy is very important, helping children to make those connections from a very defensive to a more inclusive and to a more restorative approach to thinking, and also using those 5 core competencies of SEL instead of being punitive and saying, asking, why did you do that? Helping them understand that they need to be more reflective of their own feelings and thoughts and use that as a tool in the classroom.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things about research. We're going to come back. We're going to take Francois, we're going to take about a 2-minute break here. And then when we come back, I'm going to share a little bit of research, and then we're going to ask Dr. Montenegro one more question, and then we'll wrap up our segment for tonight.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.